Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's been pretty controversial. President Trump's executive order that affects transgender women in sports. And we're going to be taking all our information from a CNN article that goes into detail about it. So we're going to try to break down exactly what is in this order, the arguments for it, against it, and what it all might mean going forward.
Well, this isn't just about who gets to be on what team. There's legal questions here, scientific research, political strategy. And these are stories about real people, trying to live their lives. So it's kind of like a snapshot of this massive debate that's going on about gender and who's included and what role the government should have in all of this.
Yeah, and that CNN article talks about Imani Kelev, who's an Olympic boxer. And Trump actually mentioned her specifically during his campaign. Imagine, working your whole life toward this goal of being an Olympic athlete, and then suddenly being pulled into this huge political debate that's way bigger than you.
Yeah.
So it really shows how real these consequences can be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to remember that we aren't just talking about ideas here. These are real people whose lives are affected by this.
So to understand what those effects might be, we need to actually understand the order itself. And it seems like it has sort of two main parts. First, it really leans on Title IX, saying that schools that get federal funding have to enforce this ban on transgender women participating in women's sports.
Yeah, and that's where all this legal stuff gets a bit tricky. So Title IX was originally meant to make education in sports more equal for women. But the way it's been interpreted has changed over time. Different presidents have different ideas about how it applies to transgender students.
Okay, so to help our listener understand that a little bit better, can you give me an example of how Title IX has been interpreted in the past versus now?
Sure. Back in the 70s, when Title IX was first passed, the focus was on making sure that women had the same opportunities to play sports as men. And back then, everyone thought separate teams based on biological sex was the way to do that. But now, we're also talking about transgender athletes. And there's this debate about whether excluding them based on their gender identity violates that spirit of equal opportunity that Title IX was supposed to be all about.
Gotcha. So that's the legal side of things. But what about the actual science here? Does the article mention any specific research about the athletic performance of transgender women?
It does, yeah. The article talks about two research studies, one from 2017 and one from 2023, and they kind of challenge this idea that transgender women have a natural advantage. So these studies are suggesting that after hormone therapy, the performance of transgender women is more in line with cisgender women, meaning women who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth.
So just to be clear for the listener, it's not as simple as saying all transgender women just have this inherent advantage. The science seems to suggest that it's much more complex than that, right?
Right, exactly. And the science is still developing and changing all the time. But these studies show that athletic success comes from a lot of different things, training, skill, dedication, coaching, not just being transgender. And it's worth pointing out that certain physical traits, like height, for example, can give any athlete an advantage. But we don't use that to exclude cisgender athletes from competing. So the question is, why should we use it to exclude transgender athletes?
This reminds me of how we allow athletes to use altitude training to increase their red blood cell count, right? It's a biological modification, but we just consider it fair play. So is hormone therapy really that different in this context?
That's a great point. It really makes you wonder about what we consider to be a fair advantage in the first place, and if those standards are always applied equally.
Yeah, for sure. And the second part of the order, it seems like the Trump administration really wants to get groups like the NCAA and even the Olympics on board with this ban.
Right, that's right. The executive order doesn't have direct control over those organizations, but it definitely shows that they want to pressure them, using public campaigns, maybe working with state attorneys general, and even using platforms like the UN to promote this ban.
So it's more like trying to get everyone on the same page, even if they can't directly force it. But the CNN article does mention some pushback, right, like from the Biden administration.
Yeah, definitely. The article highlights how different the Trump administration's approach is from Biden's stance. The Biden administration has generally been a lot more inclusive, supporting the right of transgender students to participate in sports based on their gender identity.
So basically, you've got these two very different views clashing here. One side saying it's about protecting women's sports, and the other side saying it's about protecting transgender rights. How does the article deal with this?
Well, it tries to show both sides. But it also makes it clear that a lot of people are pushing back against the Trump administration's justification of protecting women's sports, a lot of people argue that it's based on misunderstanding the science and that just the way it's framed is harmful.
It sounds like this whole thing has become a real political football, pun intended.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the article about how this connects to Trump's political strategy, especially with his 2024 campaign coming up?
Absolutely. The article actually connects this executive order back to Trump's history of targeting transgender rights. They mention the transgender military ban and how he tried to house transgender women in men's facilities, which was blocked by a court. It seems like this could be part of a bigger strategy to get a certain segment of voters on his side. It does seem that way, doesn't it? And the article even mentions that Trump has been talking about this more and more, even before he officially started campaigning again.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He talks about this one event in 2022 where he talked about transgender women in sports, and the crowd went wild. It almost felt like he knew exactly what to say to get that reaction.
Right, and that's the point, isn't it? This issue has become part of people's political strategy. It makes you wonder if these policies are really about protecting women's sports, or if it's just a way to get a certain group of voters to support you.
So it's become this big symbol in this whole cultural and political debate that we're having. And the article even says that this strategy might actually be working, at least for some people.
Exactly, and that brings up a lot of ethical questions. When politicians try to win by using these kinds of tactics, it can make people afraid to speak up, especially people who are already marginalized.
Which makes me think about what the NCAA president said, Charlie Baker, I think. He said last year in front of the Senate that out of 500,000 athletes, there were fewer than 10 known to be transgender.
Wow, yeah, that's a really small number. It seems like this is getting way more attention than the actual number of transgender athletes involved. Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. Maybe it's because people are already anxious about gender roles and things like that. It's almost like this issue has become a way for people to talk about what it even means to be male or female these days.
Yeah, you might be right. Maybe this whole debate about transgender athletes is really just a way for society to deal with all these changing ideas about gender. It makes people question everything they thought they knew about what it means to be a man or a woman.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal side of this with Title IX and the science, which is still kind of up in the air,
Yeah.
and how politicians are using this for their own benefit. What about actually enforcing this order? How is Trump going to make sure everyone follows it?
Well, the article says they're going to be very strict about it. They're talking about investigations of schools, maybe even taking away funding from schools that don't comply, and working with states to enforce their own bans.
Wow, that sounds serious. It's not just an empty threat then.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if they're overstepping their boundaries. It also shows how much power the federal government has over states and organizations.
The article also mentions this public pressure campaign. What is that all about?
That's about how the administration wants to use the media to try to change people's minds about this issue and to get organizations like the NCAA and Olympics to go along with the ban. It's like they're trying to control the whole conversation.
So they want to make it seem like it's wrong to support transgender athletes.
That's one way to look at it. And it brings us back to how this is affecting real people. Imagine you're a young transgender athlete who just wants to play sports, and suddenly everyone is telling you you don't belong, that you're dangerous, or that you're cheating.
Yeah, that must be incredibly hard, especially when you're already facing so many challenges just being transgender.
Exactly. That's why we need to listen to what transgender athletes are saying. They're the ones most affected by all of this.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the legal arguments, the scientific research, the political strategies, and how all of this affects real people. It's a lot to think about. What do you think are the most important things for our listener to understand?
Well, I think the main thing is to remember that this is a really complicated issue. There are no easy answers, and both sides have valid points.
Right, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. We have to think about fairness, about how science is used to make policy, about the rights of transgender people, and how these decisions affect people's lives.
Yeah, I agree. It's also important to remember that this isn't just about sports. This is about how we define gender and how we treat people who are different from us and how we create a society where everyone feels welcome and respected.
And all of this is happening right now. It's not some far-off debate. These are real decisions being made that are impacting people's lives right now. So it's really important to stay informed and to talk about these things and to support policies that are fair and inclusive.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that we need to be careful about believing everything we hear about the science. We need to really look at the evidence and understand what it means, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as this.
It's easy to just believe what we see in the headlines, but we have to do our own research and think critically, especially when it comes to something as politicized as this.
And we need to remember that this isn't just about numbers and data. These are real people we're talking about.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the individual people involved. I keep thinking about Amani Khalif from the CNN article. It must have been so hard for her to be in the middle of all this.
It must have been. And her story shows how important it is to have empathy. We need to listen to transgender athletes and understand what they're going through.
It feels like we're seeing this big clash of values. People want to be more understanding and accepting of transgender people. But then you have these people trying to take away their rights. And it's often based on misinformation or just using it to get votes.
Yeah, it's a real turning point. And this executive order, with all the stuff going on around it, really shows how important it is to think critically, to have these conversations based on facts, and to really fight for justice and equality for everyone.
It's easy to get lost in all the legal stuff and the political arguments. But like you said before, this is about real people's lives.
Exactly. Think about those transgender athletes who just want to play sports, to feel like they're part of something, and to be the best they can be, just like any other athlete. And their families and friends who are supporting them. This is about creating a world where everyone feels safe and respected and appreciated for who they are.
And this CNN article makes it clear that this executive order isn't just a one-off thing. It's part of a bigger pattern of Trump going after transgender rights.
Right. The article talks about the ban on transgender people in the military and how he tried to change the rules about where transgender people can live. And even using transgender rights as a way to attack other politicians. It all seems very deliberate.
So it's not just about sports. It's about how we view gender and how we treat transgender people in general.
Yeah.
These conversations can get pretty intense, as we've seen.
Yeah, they can. And it's important for everyone to remember that these debates often tap into really strong emotions. And we need to be respectful of each other even when we disagree, and be open to hearing different points of view.
I think it's also important to talk about all the misinformation out there. The CNN article even mentions that some people are against transgender athletes because they're basing their arguments on stuff that just isn't true.
Yeah, that's a big problem. We talked about how the science is complicated and always changing. We have to be careful about people twisting the facts to fit their own agenda. Being able to think for yourself and question what you hear is super important.
Especially with something like this that's become so political.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the big things you want our listener to take away from this?
I hope they realize how complex this issue really is. It's not about being right or wrong. There's the law, the science, the politics, and most importantly, how this affects real people.
And I hope they keep learning about this and talking about it with others. This isn't going to go away anytime soon.
Definitely. And most importantly, remember that this is about real people. Transgender athletes deserve our support and respect. Their stories matter, and we need to listen to what they have to say.
It's been an interesting deep dive. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and let's keep working towards a world that's fair for everyone.